My name is Erin. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Hey everyone, welcome back to another bonus episode. I thought I would read some emails, stories, and answer some questions that were sent to me over the last few months. The first comes from Ellie in the UK. Ellie and I have been emailing for a few months now, and she is just a gem. This was her original email. Erin, I recently started listening to your podcast. I have never been interested in true crime, but I listened to history podcasts and stumbled upon yours. It's real. You're real. It's kind of like listening to a friend rather than talking heads who have a staff to research and produce for them. You asked for personal crime stories, and this happened to me a few years ago. My friend Sarah and I visited a friend up north to get away from our boyfriends for a few days. We spent the first night catching up with a few bottles of wine. We had a nice fire going, so we turned off all the lights to properly enjoy it. Sometime during the third bottle, Sarah thought she heard something outside the window. Giggling like maniacal idiots because we thought Sarah was just spooked by the fire, my friend Angela and I went outside to investigate. Nothing was there, but we were so drunk we really weren't paying attention. Into the fourth bottle, Sarah says again she heard something outside the window. Angela and I kept on saying she was just drunk, and we all ended up going to bed. The next morning, we woke up to a draft and found the window open downstairs. The same window Sarah kept pointing at. There was even dirt that was brought in from the garden. We accused Sarah of trying to frighten us, but after a good row, we called the police who told us another break-in had occurred a few nights before at another house in the village. Nothing was stolen, but police did find certain evidence that whoever had broken in had taken matters into hand, so to speak. Police searched and found the same evidence on the foot of the bed Sarah and I had shared. Some pervert had jerked off on our bed while we were sleeping. Sarah and I took the train home that day, and Angela went to stay with her mom. I respect police, but I felt they didn't take the incidents as seriously as they should have. Nothing was stolen and no one got hurt, so what was the harm, right? I could not sleep without the lights on for weeks and still feel dirty. I haven't been back to Angela's because the pervert was never caught. Sarah still lords the thing over us. Thanks for the podcast, Ellie. Creepy! So since Ellie first emailed me, we've been chatting a lot about peeping toms who escalate. She's since become almost an expert and has really dived into the Golden State Killer case because Joseph DeAngelo is a perfect example of an offender who escalated. She's still not a true crime fan, but she's learning about creeps to better protect herself and other women. Ellie, good luck out there. The next comes from my cruise roommate, BC. When we first found out we were going to be sharing a stateroom on the cruise, we started emailing back and forth and had some fascinating conversations. She's even given me a lot of great feedback about the podcast. She wanted to know, in regards to the murder at the Unite the Right episode, why I didn't go into more detail about the origins of Confederate statues. I thought about it, and I had more details in the original script, but I cut it down to make time and also to make the episode seem, I guess, more balanced. In the past, I have spoken at length about Confederate statues and statues in general. The topic normally opens up a big can of worms because people are very passionate about it. Most Confederate statues were not erected until a few decades after the end of the Civil War. There were a few memorials built a few years after the war to honor fallen soldiers, but most of the statues built to honor generals and Confederate leaders, they weren't built until several decades after the war, typically after the Reconstruction and during the rise of Jim Crow, so mainly around the turn of the century. The erection of these monuments, well, they weren't necessarily to honor Confederate generals, but to create a false narrative about the glorious South and remind Black Americans that a war had been waged to keep them in bondage. The statues were meant to boost the morale of white Southerners and to keep Black Americans in their place. While some Americans see these statues simply as historical, many people see them as a reminder of servitude and bondage. We could talk about this subject for hours, but I won't drone on. If you want a really good book about Confederate statues, may I recommend Connor Town O'Neill's book, Down Along with That Devil's Bones, A Reckoning with Monuments, Memory, and the Legacy of White Supremacy. You can also check out his podcast, White Lies, produced by NPR, which was just put out a new season a few months ago, and this season's about the Cuban refugee crisis during the 1980s. I received the next email also a few months ago from Cheryl in Madison, Wisconsin. Erin, longtime listener and yada yada yada. My kids surprised me with a trip to London. Lucky. And booked me on a Jack the Ripper tour through Whitechapel. Yes, I was excited about it because I devoured almost every book about Jack the Ripper and his victims. It's the biggest whodunit in history. The night of the tour, my daughter and I toured through the streets of Whitechapel with our group, listening to our guide recite the lurid tale of Jack's murder spree. Sometime during the tour, it struck me how grotesque it all was, and how uncomfortable both my daughter and I became. We broke away from the group and found a quiet pub. We kept asking ourselves if we were horrible people because we had sought entertainment from the murders of these women. I don't know how to feel about this, and I somehow feel dirty. It's hard for me to listen to podcasts now. Cheryl, you're not a horrible person. While I am appalled by murder tours and think it's distasteful for people to wear shirts with serial killers' faces on them, it's not wrong to find some sense of entertainment in true crime. You and your daughter found the Jack the Ripper tour distasteful and left. I'm guessing it's probably because the tour glorified Jack and had little to no empathy for his victims. While I was on CrimeCruise, my roommate asked Paul Holes, who we bumped into on the pub on board, she asked him what he thought about seeking entertainment through true crime. And his answer was simple. There's nothing wrong with it as long as you remember there are families out there that are mourning the loss of a loved one, and there are real victims who have to live every day with the crimes committed against them. We seek knowledge through crime cases and stories because the unknown is scary. And yes, we're entertained by it too. We're human. I seek comfort in the knowledge that people who listen to, read, or watch true crime are more likely to help out strangers in trouble. You're not a horrible person. You are an example of a decent human being. Cheryl, keep on listening to podcasts if it brings you enjoyment. The last email came to me a few weeks ago and simply asked, if I know someone who might know something about a crime, Is it illegal for me to not talk to the police? That one made me stop. So I actually spoke with a lawyer about this one because I wasn't going to put any advice out there that I have no expertise in giving. The lawyer's advice was simple. Talk to an attorney. You cannot lie to the police, and you cannot obstruct an investigation. State laws differ over whether or not you are obligated to speak to the police if you are aware of a crime. I can't tell you what you should do. I'm not a lawyer. I can tell you what I believe I would do. I would speak to an attorney and to the police. I feel I have an obligation to victims and their families, and if my information will help catch an offender, then I'm going to say something. Talking to the police can be scary, especially if you believe someone you love did something wrong. And you keep asking yourself questions. What if the person you love hates you for dropping the dime on them? What if they get into trouble? What if they are actually innocent? The question I would be asking myself, what if they go on to hurt someone else? I've said it so many times on this podcast. You can always email me or message me if you have information about a crime and you feel uncomfortable going directly to the police. No, I am not a lawyer. No, I am not a religious advisor. And no, I am not a therapist. You don't want me as any one of those three. I am someone who is familiar with law enforcement and can get the information to them. If you know something about a crime, and not necessarily the cases I presented on this podcast, you can always contact me. Okay, so you all know that I went on CrimeCruise because I've only been talking about it since last September. I went, I saw, I had a blast. It was 4 days packed with programming and some pretty awesome people, both attendees and presenters. So there was Dr. Henry Lee, Cheryl McCollum, Paul Holes, Cece Moore, and Elena Burrows. I laughed and I cried and I learned so much. First, I'll be honest. After hearing Dr. Lee, I see the O.J. Simpson case in a whole new light. Dr. Lee is a world-renowned forensic scientist, and he worked with Simpson's defense team during the investigation trial. Without going into too much detail, because that's like a whole podcast in and of itself, Dr. Lee outlined the evidence, and it was like one of those holy shit moments where your whole world just kind of shifts on its axis. I'm not 100% convinced Simpson is not guilty, but I can see now how the jury found him not guilty. Obviously, my heart still goes out to the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and I wish they had received justice. Cece Moore, she's always a treat to listen to. And if you haven't already, I suggest watching her show, The Genetic Detective. And I think you can still find that on Hulu. What's so great about Cece is that she started genealogy as an amateur and built it into a career to help adoptees, crime victims, and law enforcement. She doesn't have a degree. She doesn't have a background in science. She started working her own family tree and her career just grew from there. She's now one of the most successful genetic genealogists in the world, and she has helped solve, dozens of cases. She's also incredibly sweet. Cheryl McCollum was fabulous. Oh my gosh. She was funny, smart, and I loved her. Mac is a crime analyst, author, and founder of the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute. During the cruise, she presented the case of 17-year-old Tammy Jackson, who was viciously murdered in Savannah, Georgia in 1994. Mac presented the case to the group with the blessing of Tammy's family and asked the group for any ideas and questions, anything to help investigators move the case forward just a little bit. And let me tell you, there were no punches pulled during this presentation, and it wasn't for the faint of heart. Even Elena Burrows and Paul Holes gave their interpretation about the crime scene and also possible offenders. Mac also did a live recording of her podcast, Zone 7, and presented the cold case of Molly Miller and Colt Haynes, which I spoke about on the very first episode of this podcast. You should really listen to her podcasts and also read her book, Cold Case, Pathways to Justice. And I just ordered that, so I'm really excited for it to come in. Elena Burrows is a retired CSI out of Florida and worked several high-profile cases, including the Casey Anthony case in 2008. Today she has her own TV show, Crime Scene Confidential, and continues to assist law enforcement. Each and every one of her presentations made me tear up because you can tell she has such great empathy for victims and their families. I really liked her presentation when she actually read us some of her journal entries, and it really gave you a behind-the-scenes look at what CSIs go through during investigations and how they are personally impacted by them. And I also really dig her pink hair. She is 100% herself, and I love that. And then, of course, there was Paul Holes, the man who helped solve the Golden State Killer case, and so many more. Paul is a retired cold case investigator from California and has gone on to be in, I think, 2 of his own TV crime shows. He's in 2 podcasts right now, or he's on 2 podcasts, Buried Bones and Small Town Dicks, and he also wrote a memoir, Unmasked, which is great. He continues to assist law enforcement with cold cases, and my favorite of Paul's presentations was Bring Your Own Bourbon. It was a nice hour of cocktails and Q&A, and he talked about everything from cases, podcasts, to even his own workout routine. And believe it or not, that came from a dude. That didn't come from one of his female fans. But I do think out of all the presenters, he got teased the most. Overall, it was a wonderful time. I'm not a cruise person, and the food was just okay. But I went for the true crime, and I wasn't disappointed at all. I also met 2 lovely Canadian women, who they kept me on my toes during the cruise. I loved them. I did fry in Mexico, and I did have the Wibbly Wobblies for a few days after the cruise, which is actually called, I did not know this, it's called mal de debarquement. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it's an actual syndrome. Like after you get off of a boat, you still feel like you're on a boat for a few days afterwards. Anyways, I didn't know that. But overall, yeah, I would definitely do another crime cruise. And if any of my Crime Cruise friends are listening, I already miss you all. I know some of you have already contacted me, but I want to hear what you thought about the cruise as well. So that does it for now, friends. I think the next time you hear from me will be on episode 1 of season 2. And I'm going to get that out here shortly. I'm very excited about the new season and all the stories and cases I have planned for you. Remember, I love hearing from you all, so please email or message me on Instagram. Until then, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Bye.